Sorry, the video, but I might not post it. Maybe. I have probably post it. Holy Jesus!
You're going to Hawaii.
Tonight and tomorrow, for the first time ever.
Everyone, this is Minnie Mouse.
Idol's headed to Disney's Alani.
I haven't either.
But this trip is no vacation.
Neither of us have.
Go home.
Are you serious?
We can't say yes to all of them. It's the final judgment.
You're not in our top 20.
American Idol, tonight and tomorrow at 8/7 Central on ABC.
Conversation with the candidate continues.
Ha.
Welcome back to Conversation with the Candidate and our candidate,
You're
Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld. We have our New Hampshire Town Hall audience with us here. We're
No,
going to get
you're
to as
not.
many questions as we can. We're going to start with Christy St. Laurent.
Hello. Good evening, Governor Weld. In the unusual
this
setting of a
is-
primary challenge from within the incumbent's party,
Did you
how
really
do you
though?
anticipate keeping the discussion out of the schoolyard and focused on
Crap! Nathan!
I'm going to try to emphasize what I want to do as President of the United States, and there's a lot on my
I hate
mind.
cops. I use an
I think
attack
Washington does a very poor job of cutting spending. As a matter of fact, they don't do any job of cutting spending and cutting taxes, both of which I did as
Tax
governor in
better.
Massachusetts. In fact,
I used
right
to like
after I got
cops.
in, I was ranked the most fiscally conservative
Only if you're
governor
trying to
in the United
sweat.
States, and that was
Cops are
as a
better.
Republican in Massachusetts, succeeding Michael Dukakis. So that took some doing, but I do think that's important. And they're all, including the
I'm not
president,
trying to
they're off in the
build
wrong
or sweat or
direction
anything.
on this $1 trillion of deficit a year. The president's most recent budget would add, admittedly a 10-year budget, but it would add $7.9 trillion more dollars to the deficit. The
They kind of
millennials, our
will.
children and grandchildren, are going to pay that bill. So that would be my first focus as president.
Thank you, Christy. Our next question comes from Sam Kluger.
Governor Weld.
Okay, I'm going sweaty
What
mode.
is
This
your
ain't
stance
even
on the
fun.
United States pulling out
I don't have my
Paris
sweat
Climate
skin
Agreement,
on, though.
And what steps will you take to ensure that my generation
I'm gonna
and
try
my
that.
children's generation
Wait,
can
pause,
enjoy
no,
their
keep
lives
going.
in an environmentally healthy environment?
Well, I think
can
the
get my
president
sweat
pulling
stuff.
us out of the Paris Climate Accords was a disaster. And I would rejoin on day one. I think we have to adopt 2050
You go
CO2
to-
limitations
At the office.
consonant with what other industrialized nations are doing. I don't think that the industrialized North, to oversimplify, can save the unindustrialized, lesser developed South. We've already had the benefits of the industrial
sweating now. I'm
revolution.
using the
We're going
phone.
to sit on what we've got, and now you've got to agree to limit all your CO2. You know, I think maybe there could be compensation for them agreeing to put rainforests in the state
You didn't see that.
situation where they are now,
Up
and
yes.
something could be worked out. But we've got to show leadership there, or
Oh,
else
crap.
these white mountains aren't going to be white anymore because they're not going to have snow on them. And the polar ice cap is going to melt, and all our coastlines, including the seacoast of New Hampshire, is going to be rearranged, and there's going to be a lot of shorefront property that's not shorefront now because it's 10 miles inland.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Our next question comes from Elizabeth Radisich.
Good evening, thank you. While I share some of the values of the Republican Party as the mom of two
She's a
African-American
foul.
children
I saw
and as
that.
a woman, I don't feel like the Republican Party has an umbrella of inclusiveness.
Bro, I suck.
How would you change your party so, as a moderate woman like me with a multiracial family, I feel like the party actually wants my vote?
Well, it wouldn't take any acting on my part, I'll tell you that. I shouldn't have to say this, but I will say this. I've never groped a woman anywhere, and I never will. Honestly, and if 13 women came forward and all
crap.
said that I groped them, I'd be very
Nathan got me.
unlikely to say,
Nate
well,
and Nate and not-
It seemed vanishingly unlikely. You know, when I was in office, I was
Oh,
known
crap.
for
I
inclusiveness,
suck.
and that includes racial as well as just trying to unleash everybody's energy. But I appointed an
course
African
Nathan's
American
good.
Commission, Asian American, Hispanic American. I met with them all once a month, and they felt included. It relates to another issue I care about, which is immigration. The president's rhetoric seems to be he wants to make everybody feel terrible. Anybody who's you know, not been a citizen here for 25 years, and I think the job of the president is to make everybody feel good about being an American, and I think it's bad for the whole country, and from a prudential point of view, by prudential I mean preserving social cohesion if people live in the shadows. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I was the first guy out of the block
Yeah,
with gay
but
and lesbian.
we don't have
lesbian
name tags
civil
on
rights. My first
But
year
we
in
could
office,
see you on
and I
the
was,
mini
believe me,
map.
by myself for 20,
Yeah.
25 years there, because I think when people live in the shadows, that should not exist in a democracy. You know, that can exist under tyranny because that's part of what the tyrant wants. But I think on both gender and racial grounds, you would find me probably about as friendly a public administrator as you'd ever want to meet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We now have a social media question coming from Daniel Schrock. He asks, Governor Wilt, what will change from being governor of the Commonwealth to being president of the United States, and what would you do differently?
Well, I try to do sort of the same type of thing I did as governor. I put in place
President,
policies that would unleash everybody's energies, make everybody feel included. My cabinet was eight women and 3 men, and always included minorities. I didn't want anyone to feel that they weren't part of the equation. So that's something
Oh,
I want to bring
crap.
to Washington, where, guess what? It doesn't reside right now. You know, it's not only the president. The situation of the D and the R parties,
No, actually, don't kill him.
sometimes seem to me
I was my kill.
to exist
kid.
mainly for the purpose of killing
die.
the other party. You know,
Oh,
that's a great point
Nathan, I
of meeting
hate
with
you.
the Democratic legislature
Okay, now I'm gonna
leaders
go for the
every week. Because it's hard to, you know, stab somebody in the back if you know you're going to see them
Yeah, well,
over
he's not
coffee
gonna
and
fight.
cookies sometime in the next 7 days. And that was very
Oh my
successful.
God!
And they
What?
kept
Stop!
that
Like,
tradition to this
Okay,
day.
yeah, okay.
Charlie
Go
Baker,
sweaty
who's a
again.
two-time
Sweaty
cabinet
mode.
member for me, who's now the governor of Massachusetts, meets with the Democratic Speaker and the Senate President every single week, and it's good for the people because you hammer out policies that nobody's screaming and kicking about because it's been through a process of analysis by both parties across the aisle.
So perhaps re-energizing the social relationships and networks in Washington.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Rachel Spirer.
Hi. Welcome, Governor Wilt.
Thank you.
And your answer ties in with what I'm going to be asking.
Okay.
As president, how would you, as our leader, work to break down the deep divisions that we currently have in our government, and especially on Capitol Hill?
Well, that's right. And my first job in government, I worked for Senator Javits of New York, who was a moderate Republican senator with many, many Democratic friends. And this is in my early 20s. I was writing his speeches about Latin America. But the thing that sticks with me is that was a time when lions still roamed the earth in the Senate. And there were a lot of very well-known senators, and if one of them was going to give a major speech in the Senate, the Senate galleries would be filled with interns like myself and members of the press and members of the public who wanted to hear the speech in real time to see whether they would be persuaded. And that's part of how policy was hammered out. And those days are gone. If someone's giving a major speech now, it's given at 3 in the morning in a totally dark chamber, and the rules of C-SPAN don't let them stray from the face of the candidate. So no one knows the chamber is dark and no one is there. And the reason is because the speech is not being given to persuade. It's being given for polemical reasons to stake out a position that that party can then use for fundraising. So, you know, my approach would be kind of the opposite of what they've had in Washington for better than a decade now. I think the trend really started in the 90s, but it's been going on for some time, and it's just no way to
I'm starting to
run
suck
a railroad.
again.
Unless your obsession,
I need some more chocolate milk.
your only obsession
I'm
is
stuck.
being reelected, then it's a great way to run it.
Thank you.
That wasn't fair. I was stuck. I need some chocolate milk. I'll play better.
National president of U.S. term limits, so you can.
I get
you
sweat
can guess
better.
Where I am.
My controller will be full of
obsessed
water.
with being reelected, as in not.
Well, what would be appropriate term limits for the House, and would you approve them for the Senate as well?
What just
2 terms
happened?
for the
Bro, I
Senate
can't
and
even
3 or 4
aim.
terms for the House. Well, 12 years for the Senate and 6 or 8 for the House.
I can't aim.
If they were limited to 2 terms?
Yeah, I
What
think
is wrong
so.
with me?
I mean,
It's because
the
everything's-
truth is, if you can't get done what you
Wait,
want
let's knock
done in
everything
about
down.
6 months, you haven't been very effective, and that doesn't matter whether you're a senator
Knock everything down,
or
I
a
said.
president. You know, I always tell people who are running for office, if you don't have a short priority list, maybe you shouldn't be running for that office. And
Let's just go
when I ran
fight
for
over here,
governor of
follow me.
Massachusetts, I wanted to change the fiscal policy so we wouldn't be spending
Let's go
money
fight
like a
where-
bunch of drunken sailors. I was coming right
Because
after 3 terms of Governor Dukakis, who's a good friend, former law partner of mine, but they really had gotten that government huge. It was 88,000 state employees at the height
What
of
the hell? How did you-
Governor Dukakis' run for the presidency in 1988, and I cut
How?
that down to 62,000 in short order after
Oh,
I
sorry,
got in
you
there
get to
because
go
it
in,
really
that was funny.
wasn't necessary.
You get to
Another
kill me. Since
reform
this is for the
question
medal,
coming
you
from
get to
social
kill me.
media. Palma Borns asks, what will you do
Break
to reform the welfare
those! Break
system?
those, Spotify.
Well, I did a welfare reform in 1994 in Massachusetts, which became the model for the 1996 federal welfare reform. It was an example of the states being laboratories of democracy.
What do you mean?
And what I
Lisa?
did was put in a work requirement.
He left,
assuming
remember?
that people didn't have any preschool-age children, so that they were able to take work. And it had been drawn to
can't
my
tell.
attention earlier that people spend a lot of time looking for work and studying for work and thinking about
Okay,
work.
ready?
But
3,
in my view,
2,
there's no substitute
1,
for
go.
work. So if they said I can't find a job, we said as part of this bill that I got passed, well, don't worry,
did it
we
have-
got plenty of jobs for you. There are schools and there are prisons and there's painting that needs to be done. There's cleanup that needs to be done. We'll give you a job. 30 hours a week.
I don't
We're not
know.
going to crush anybody. And if you got little kids you got to take care of.
Where are
you're
you?
exempt.
Oh, you spawned over
Well, the
here?
welfare rolls went like that.
What are you doing? We don't have to break it down.
Because there were a lot of people who
No,
really
cut
didn't
you
need
down.
to be in that situation. Of course, everyone called me. They said I was grinding the face of the poor. Quite the contrary. I was preserving the system so that it could fulfill the function that it was designed for. That was the model for the 1996 Welfare Act as well.
Our next question comes from Brody
Oh,
Deshae.
I love these pistols.
Nice to meet you, Governor Weld. My question is about what are
Wait
you
a
going
second.
to do to reduce the
Look at
federal
that.
government's debt, and how will you prevent large deficits?
Well, I do what I did as governor in Massachusetts, and that's to engage in what's called zero-based budgeting. And instead of doing what they do in Washington, which is
Yeah,
to start
zero.
every budget account with last year's number plus 5% or 10%.
I'm good with you. Let's wait,
what
pause,
you do is
pause, pause,
analyze
let me
what
do it.
happened last year.
Okay,
And
go.
if there were a lot of good outcomes, like
Stupid
a
spawn
preventive
protection.
health program that kept a lot of people from getting sicker and saved a lot of
Eagles
taxpayers'
only.
healthcare dollars, you might multiply that appropriation by 5 or 10.
I
But
suck.
if there was an obscure,
Why
sub-bureau of
am
mines
I
or something
sucking?
which had been there for 30 years with a guy,
I have
doing crossword
never
puzzles
sucked with
at his
Eagles.
desk, and it got $5 million last year, as it always had.
Never
in the
mind,
past,
that's so
you
boring.
zero that out, and you can save a lot of money that way. And that was why the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute said
No.
that I was the most fiscally conservative governor in the country in my first term.
I'm not using the data.
Thank you, Brody. Next question comes from Sean Bentley.
Good evening, Governor Weld. What do you think differentiates you the most when compared to President Trump?
Well, I'm kind of a calm individual, slow to anger, and I enjoy life and enjoy making a contribution to the public good. I think the president is kind of all over the place. A lot of it seems to be about the president and not about the people that he was elected to serve. And I know that's a psychological thing and a personal thing, not a policy difference, but I think it's the biggest difference.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Next question.
Oh, headshot! That was dirty!
The process of
That
bringing
was
medicines
kinda
to market
dirty.
goes through a multi-billion-dollar approval process to get the drug to market, which in turn creates high drug prices.
Cause
What
I
would
was
you do
playing
to
with him
address
right
this?
now. And I was
Well,
playing
high drug
GTS.
prices, a couple things we could do is let people buy
I was playing GTA,
pharmaceuticals
alright.
across state lines and in other
Hey!
countries like Canada.
That's
That would be
fine.
somewhat of a help.
That put me off
And,
somehow.
I do think that...
Why did that
this
make-
is the
No, don't
system
fly,
that
you
we do
cheated.
recognize that the process of development
You
of
were.
pharmaceuticals is expensive, and we allow companies to recoup those costs. But, there are variables here, like how long is the period of patent protection before it goes to generic? It's now 17 years. Could there be, movement around the edges there?
What do you
having
think you
been
got?
governor of the
14?
state,
I got 48.
there was a huge biotech
That's
industry,
funny.
partly as a result of
That's
incentives
funny.
I put in when I was governor. When I came
I
in,
know.
we were losing
I put spawn
biotech
pads in.
companies to Illinois to New Jersey to Research Triangle and the Carolinas. By the
It
end
doesn't
of my
matter.
first term, I put in so
We'll
many
later.
incentives for the biotech industry that if you were a biotech company and you
Wait,
did
what?
not have an office in Kendall Square, Cambridge,
Oh,
you were at
I
a
thought you said
competitive
don't kill me.
disadvantage. And that was very good.
I
for,
thought you said don't kill me. You
so
said
I'm
don't kill
not here
me.
to demonize the pharmaceutical industry at all. I do think that particularly for the elderly, the cost of pharmaceuticals, prescription drugs, has gotten totally out of hand. So that would be probably a high-level task force personally supervised by, me or my top Health and Human Service Secretary. And I have some sense of the trade-offs that are involved here and the needs of industry, but the even more important needs
surprise protection.
of individuals not to get priced out of the market where they can get the pharmaceuticals that they need.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Aaron. Our next question comes from Spencer Diaz.
Good evening, Governor Weld. How would you handle the crisis in Venezuela, and how would you apply this to all foreign crises?
Well, I think the crisis in Venezuela has been handled pretty well. I thought it took some nerve to recognize Guaido as the head of the country when Maduro was still there. Maduro seems to be the first foreign dictator that President Trump has.
Wait, I thought
has
you
met that he
said
doesn't
go.
really like.
What?
He's
I
a
must
great
be-
admirer
I
of
actually
Putin
did.
and Kim
said
in North
go.
Korea and Viktor Orban, not yet a dictator.
I thought
but
you said
wants
go.
to take Hungary out of the Western
Can we go
orbit
now?
into the Soviet
Yep, you will.
sphere of influence. Duterte in the Philippines, who personally kills people with guns, personally kills
That's not a pump, that's a
suspected
Delaware.
of dealing in narcotics. So this is a refreshing change. I was down in Colombia a couple of weeks ago and met one night for dinner
I'm gonna
with
go forward.
former
I'm
President
running away from
Manuel Santos, who got the Peace
I'm
Prize
running
for
away from you, my
getting the
lollipop
Colombian
guys.
rebels to come to the
Hey,
table.
buddy.
And the next
What's up, guys?
next day met with for dinner
Remember
with
this
President
guy?
Duque, who's
Yeah,
the new
seen him before.
president of Colombia,
Do you know
42
that
years
guy?
old. And the Colombians, of course, are very interested in what goes on
No, who is
next
that?
door in Venezuela. As a matter of fact, it was
Used to be
Colombians
together in
taking
Massachusetts.
That's gonna be the end of the
military aid
video.
across